Hey! In this video, we are going to make signs like these with a Dremel, the Plunge router 335 and some wood carving bits. We are going to focus on engraving the sign quickly without too much effort or too many time-consuming steps. We should be able to finish the sign in about an hour or two of work time. This means that the lines will not be perfect, but they will be acceptable. And we will have a good-looking sign at the end. There's two types of styles we can go for when making signs. We can remove the material around the letter, or we can remove the material inside of the letters. When making a sign with the Plunge router, it is better to remove the material inside of the letter since it needs a flat surface to use as a guide. And it is also quicker because we have to remove less material. Let's get started. For this project, we're going to use a plank from this pallet, which is most likely either pine or spruce wood. We cut the plank from the pallet with any saw available. Then we measure how big it needs to be. We cut it to size with a miter saw. Then we cut the corners to 45 degrees to give it some design features. Now sand it down on the side that we're going to engrave. We can use a sanding pad like this, but if you have a tabletop sander or some other powered sander, it will be faster to use that. The backside can stay rough. As long as it is flat, it works. Now we can use some foam padded double-sided tape and attach it to the rough side of the plank. Then firmly secure the plank to the workbench. We will trim down the edges of our blank with one of these edge routing bits for the Dremel. For this project, I'll use the 618 chamfer bit. Just set up the Dremel in the Plunge router at a high RPM. Set the bit to a reasonable depth and run the bit along the edges of the plank. Now we have a clean blank that we can use for the engraving. Once again, I find my designs on Google Fonts. I'm using this font called Wave. This font is thick, has rounded edges, a lot of smooth curves and few details. This makes it very quick and easy to engrave with a Dremel. For this project, I'm going to engrave the word welcome. So I print it out in a few different sizes so I can pick the one that fits the blank the best. To transfer the design to wood, we use carbon paper. I line up the design with the blank, then tape down the top part with masking tape. Now I put carbon paper underneath, then tape it down on all four sides. Now we just trace around all of the lines. I'm scribbling a little bit back and forward because the grain of this wood really wants to guide the pencil. And now we're done and this is how it looks. If you need to fix up any of the lines, you can do it now. I'm just going to go over the lines one more time so you can see it better. The main tool I will be using is a Dremel. I'm using the Dremel 8220 and the Dremel 4250 at the moment. It is nice to not have any cords, so I'm going to use the 8220 until it runs out of battery. I'm also using the Plunge router attachment. It transforms your Dremel into a mini Plunge router. I will make a full video on how to use this soon. I'm only going to use two bits for this engraving. This egg-shaped aluminum cutting bit and this flathead cutting bit. Both of these bits come from this cheap set of aluminum cutting burrs. I've been really impressed with how well these bits perform when cutting wood, so I can highly recommend them. I'll leave a link in the description below. I also use this Dremel 490 dust blower when engraving with the workstation. It blows away the dust and makes the visibility better. When finding the depth, I like to just measure by eye. I don't really use any of the measurement scales. I'm aiming for a depth of about 2 to 3 millimeters. I will start removing the bulk of the material with this egg-shaped bit. I adjust the depth stop to the same depth for more stability. Tighten these black covers well. They have a tendency of becoming loose when we use the Dremel. You can release the knob at this point if you want, and work by plunging the bit up and down. But I prefer to just keep the bit locked in the bottom position and just lifting the tool up when switching to the next letter. Before we get started, it is a good idea to test the depth of your cut on some scrap wood. Once you're happy with how it looks, we can move on to the actual engraving. Start by running the Dremel at a high RPM and carefully plunge it into the middle of the first letter. The goal here is to remove most of the material without getting too close to the lines. If your bit is nice and sharp, the wood should come off cleanly and easily. But if your bit is starting to get dull, you'll notice how the wood might flare up a bit, which can make it harder to see what you're doing. When that happens, just stop the Dremel and clean things up with a bit of sandpaper to remove the fuzz. Once that is cleared up, fire up the Dremel again and start working your way slowly to the drawn lines. Don't stress too much about following the lines exactly. They're really just guidelines. What matters more is keeping a steady hand and making sure your cuts look smooth and intentional. And that is the first letter done. From here, it's just a matter of repeating the same process for the rest of the letters. Now with all the letters carved, here's what the engraving looks like so far. If you like the softer, rounded look, you can stop here. It already looks pretty nice. But for my project, I want those sharp 90-degree edges. So I'm switching to a flathead cutting bit. If your flathead cutting bit is sharp, you can actually do the entire engraving with just that. I adjust the flathead cutting bit to just a little bit deeper than the first pass, about 4 to 5 millimeters. Then it's back to the same process. Slowly remove material from all the letters. You likely run into a few tight spots where the bit wants to push outside the lines. Since we're not aiming for perfection here, I just push through. If the lines get reshaped a little bit, that's totally fine. In sharp corners or angles, you'll want to slow down and take very small bites. The wood can chip pretty easily if you apply too much pressure in those tight spots. And after that second pass, here's what we're left with. Not bad, especially for just 30 minutes of engraving. There's a bit of fuss around the edges of the letters, and you can still see the lines we transferred with the carbon paper. To clean all that off, grab some fine grit sandpaper and give the surface a good sanding. If you have a power sander, even better, it'll speed things up a lot. Once the surface is cleaned up, you'll get a better view of the lines. This is a good time to check if any parts need a quick touch-up with the Dremel before we move on to finishing the engraving. You might also notice some leftover fuzz in the grooves. Just take a knife and carefully scrape or cut that out. There are plenty of options when it comes to finishing and texturing the engraving, but since we're working with this light pine or spruce wood, I'm going to use a propane torch to burn the surface around the letters. First, I make sure I'm in a safe area before starting. Then I carefully burn the wood surface, being mindful not to overdo it. I want to avoid turning it into charcoal. The sharp edges of the engraved letters tend to catch the flame more easily, creating a dark, burnt outline around them. I think that effect looks pretty cool. It really makes the letters pop. After burning the wood, I take some fine grit sandpaper and give the project a light sanding. Since we burned the area around the letters to a dark color, I'm going to paint the inside of the letters with a bright color. So we're going to use this white paint to increase the contrast between the letters and the background a little bit more. We make sure to clear all the dust before we start painting. The paint I'm using is a water-based acrylic paint that is meant for hobby use. I chose it because the package said you could use it on wood. It came in many different colors and is touch dry in 15 minutes. Once the paint has completely dried, I'm going to use this clear spray lacquer and spray the entire engraving to give it some protection and shine. And this is the final result. Now you know how to engrave a sign with a Dremel and a Plunge router. And that is pretty cool.